Senate Committee Room, A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305. Did you know that you can watch the Senate live on YouTube? Visit the channel by browsing to youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. That's youtube.com/@Senate of Virginia. Senate Committee Room, A305.
Good morning. In the interest of time, we want to go on and get started. Good morning again, and welcome to the first meeting of the Special Subcommittee on Federal Impacts of Resources. First, I want to thank the other members here today for agreeing to participate in this important subcommittee to better understand the impacts that various federal actions may have on the resources available to the Commonwealth. We created this special subcommittee so that we can assess how changes in federal policy, grant funding, and employment may affect the Commonwealth's resources and our ability to deliver services to Virginians. Our objective is to conduct a thorough examination of these changes in order to better understand the impact on the fiscal conditions of the Commonwealth and how the state may need to respond accordingly. For today's meeting, we will start this process with a presentation from Sonia Waddell from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. She will provide an overview of the current state of the U.S. and Virginia economies and discuss the risk to the economic outlook. This will serve as a baseline for future meetings of the special subcommittee as we continue to monitor economic data that future policy changes may impact this outlook. At future meetings, we will hear from other experts who will provide this special subcommittee with the necessary data and insights to help us better understand the challenges and opportunities presented by federal policy and funding changes that may impact the state's resources. And I encourage the subcommittee members to reach out to staff with questions or possible suggestions as we go forward. As is the tradition of the Senate, I know that we will all approach these discussions with a commitment to bipartisan problem solving and a dedication to maintaining the Commonwealth's strong commitment to fiscal stewardship and ensuring that we can best serve the residents of the Commonwealth. With that, just before I invite the speaker to come up, I'd like for the members of this special subcommittee to introduce themselves, starting to my far right with Senator Obenchain.
How'd I get to your far right? Happy to be here, though. Mark Obenchain from Shenandoah Valley, 2nd Senate District.
I think right indicates correct, not just dissent. Madam Chairman, thank you for having us here, and we look forward to working to solve problems as well. As we look, I think we're going to hear some really positive things about the economy, positive things about the job opportunities that are available in Virginia, and we look forward to continuing to work as a Senate to come up with solutions for the Commonwealth. I'm Ryan McDougall. I am here. It is spring break, and my daughter Reagan is here with me. Very excited that we are not out on spring break somewhere, and live in Hanover and represent the 64 corridor down to James City and across to the Middle Peninsula and Gloucester and Matthews.
Deeds 99 to 143 on 64, everything from Earlysville to the James River north of Lynchburg. Glad to be here.
Mamie Locke, representing the 23rd Senate District, all of the city of Hampton and half of the city of Newport News.
And I'm Scott Survell on the far left, the 34th Senate District, which is Eastern Fairfax County, where, depending on the zip code, between 1 and 4 and 1 of 5 people work for the federal government. So interested to be here and come up with some solutions.
And I'm L. Louise Lucas. I'm chair of the Special Joint Subcommittee. I represent the cities of Portsmouth and Chesapeake now. For the last 30 years, I represented 12 localities, so it's really a comfort just to have to go to 2 localities for the first time. But we're all here because we are very interested in how the federal impacts will affect the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we're here to try to make sure that we can find some resolve for those Virginians who might be adversely affected by those policies. And so with that said, I now invite our speaker for today, Sonia Waddell, to begin her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I will say that my kids' spring break tends to fall during FOMC preparation, so I know how it feels to be working during that week. And I apologize. I did actually have a conversation yesterday with some of you around sort of the economy. What I wanted to do today in conversation with staff was place some of the federal government impacts that we're seeing sort of in the context of the broader economy. I will try to bring in different information, although some of the slides might be the same as what we saw yesterday. I started at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in January of 2008, so 2 months before Bear Stearns collapsed. I find it hard to say that this is a particularly challenging time to talk about the economy in that context, but I think it is, in part because we have data that is through the fourth quarter or through January, February of this year, and then we have sentiment indexes or some early indicators of what we might expect to see, but trying to figure out where we're going is a little bit challenging because we have a very different environment maybe today than we did in the fourth quarter of last year. On the whole, the real economy has remained remarkably resilient. So I will talk about GDP. I will talk about where we are with inflation, employment changes that we've seen. There are some signs that some consumers, households, businesses are showing a little bit more trepidation than they were, say, a few months ago. And I'll talk about some of the things that we've seen in the surveys that we've run. And of course, as you all know, since you're sitting here in Virginia, the large presence of the federal government, which has in some ways, protected the state from some business cycle movements in the past, kind of make a different environment for what we might see going forward. And we saw that in 2013 and 2014 as well with sequestration. So this is the broadest measure of economic activity that we have at the national level, gross domestic product. The red dots are the predictions, or the median forecast, I should say, of the Federal Open Market Committee participants for where GDP growth will be at the end of each of those years. So with the most recent forecast that came out in March, the median prediction is 1.7% growth in 2025. That is not inconsistent with other forecasts that we've seen for this year. For this quarter and for this year. You can see by these bars, and we did actually cut off, by the way, if you look at the axes, the vertical axis, if you don't kind of squish that down, the effects of the pandemic completely overshadow any other changes that we've seen. So the Great Recession doesn't look like anything, actually, even, and seeing the more recent movements is very difficult. But you can see from some of the more recent movements that, even though in 2022, 2023, there was an expectation that we were going to see either a pullback in economic activity or a slowdown in growth, we didn't really see that. The expectation is to see some of that slowdown in 2025 and 2020 and 2026. So, like I said, we haven't seen a very sharp pullback at all in the last few years. That is represented in the payroll employment data as well. So this is, again, national. The bars are the average changes for the month over the quarters, over the months of that quarter. So in February, we added 151,000 jobs. January was 125,000 jobs. All of these numbers, and in fact, all of the numbers that you see here since 2021 are enough to keep up with the growth in the working age population. So we have been growing employment. Now, there are some indications that we have seen sort of a slowing or a softening in employment activity, but it is also sort of a normalization, right? So you can look at, for example, job postings that were at the highest rate that we've ever seen in 2022. Those are back down to more normal levels. Quits rates are back down to about where they were in 2015, 2016. We can look at our measures that we do with our surveys as well, and all of that just sort of indicates a normalization. Kind of coming off of the really tight labor market that we saw in 2022 and 2023. This 151,000 jobs in February does also reflect a 10,000 federal government job reduction in that month. That is kind of most people are sort of attributing that to the hiring freeze that we saw in January, and I will talk more about that when we talk about sort of unemployment and federal compensation claims. So this is employment index to 100 in February of 2020. Which means that to the extent that our states, so for those of you who don't know, this is the 5th Federal Reserve District, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, almost all of West Virginia, DC, and Maryland, but we include all of West Virginia in this measure. So it's employment indexed in February of 2020, which means to the extent that we're back above that horizontal line, we have regained the losses of the pandemic associated recession. So the top two lines there, that's North Carolina and South Carolina, they've seen very strong growth. And in fact, this only goes back to 2020, but we can go back to 2010, 2011, when we started to see that really strong employment growth in North Carolina and South Carolina. And then you have Virginia and the US are kind of in line with each other in the middle. And then you have Maryland, West Virginia, and then the District of Columbia. DC actually never regained the employment levels that they had pre-pandemic. So Virginia, as you can kind of see from this chart, if you look at the trend, saw some pretty robust, solid employment growth in 2024. It has slowed down a little bit in 2025. In particular, we saw a decline in February in professional business services, as well as accommodation and food services. We also saw a decline in a slight decline in federal government employment in Virginia in February.
Madam Chair.
Senator Serval.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure whether you want to use the request to speak button or just jump in, but.
Yes.
Okay. I had a question for, okay. So I said it's sort of a baseline data question, because I see on your last chart, you have DC down here under subperforming or not recovering to pandemic level economic growth. One of the things that I've heard in other presentations is that the way data is kept, that even though people might live in Virginia because their job's in DC, it might not count for Virginia.
Correct.
And given, I saw some presentations about a year ago about how the DC metropolitan statistical area was performing. A George Mason study said 319th in America, which is near the bottom of the barrel for the entire DC metro region. And because many of the jobs are in DC, but people work in Virginia, the data might not reflect in Virginia's data. And so I'm trying to understand, when I look at your charts, sort of how to fit that into what you're giving us, because I'm not.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is place of work, which means that if we see fewer people, so this employment growth is actually, so if you see firms growing, say in Virginia, but everybody who works for that firm lives in California, but they're technically employed by a Virginia-based employer, you'll see it show up as Virginia employment in this data, right? And so one of the things that we might be seeing here is an impact on Virginia, but we also haven't seen population come back in DC. A lot of this is sort of leisure and hospitality workers that haven't come back in DC. So we can disaggregate that. The other thing that we can look at is the unemployment rate. And Virginia still has a very low unemployment rate, even relative to other states. I don't have that here. That's by place of residence. So if we're looking at the unemployment rate, that is actually the people who are living in Virginia and working in Virginia, because that's a household measure. Household survey. Does that?
Chair?
Senator.
My recollection from a different presentation I watched was that when people file unemployment claims, the claim is counted where the job is. So that, for example, if somebody works in my district and they drive to take the metro over the Wilson Bridge into DC every day, that when they file for unemployment, that's going to show up in DC's stats, but not Virginia's stats. And given that 1 in 5 people, 1 in 4 in my district, as I said earlier, works in DC, and the same thing's true for Arlington, Alexandria, Internova. I'm just trying to understand, is that accurate? I mean, I understand that the unemployment rate, but in terms of where the unemployment claim is filed.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're talking about 3 different types of data. So we have the payroll employment data, which is what this is, which is about, it's a sample of the 92% of employment where employers have to submit for unemployment insurance claims. So that's what this is. This is payroll employment data. Then we have the unemployment rate, which is a survey of about 60,000 households across the US. That's by place of work. Then what you're asking about is unemployment claims, which is actually a really good measure to look at right now because it's weekly. And actually, if you are in contact with the VEC, you can get it even before it goes out publicly. Those are submitted, I think you're right, they're submitted to the place of work. So that if you are living in Virginia and you are working for, it's easier for me to think about private sector, but this works the same for the UCFE data, I think. So if you are working for an institution in the District of Columbia, you would file for unemployment with the District of Columbia. And then it would, right? And then, so that's my understanding as well. But we can actually look at, because the other thing that we've been looking at for federal government employment is the American Community Survey data. Because if you look at it would be great to have the household survey data granular enough to break it out by where people are working. We can't do that at the state level, or in particular not at the community level. If you want to look at counties, you have to look at the American Community Survey data. That's also by place of residence, and I would be more than happy to come back and talk about, or I'm sure that there are other people as well that you could hear from who could talk about how each of those data sort of tell a slightly different but also accurate story of the impact of federal government workforce. And then spending is another thing that we have to think about on state.
Okay, thank you.
Senator McDougal.
Madam Chairman, thank you. But as we look at this, I just want to make sure we're I'm looking at it the same way that everybody else is. The District of Columbia has been underperforming since 2020 and certainly has maintained a pretty flat trajectory of underperforming since 21. But Virginia, since about that time, has been on an upward increase. Am I looking at that correctly? That
Correct.
DC has been negatively flat for at least since the 20s?
Correct. So for employers in DC, the amount of people that they're employing, that growth has been flat since 2020, whereas in Virginia, it's been growing. Not as quickly as some other states, but more quickly than other states.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to employment. If we think about the major policy issues that are on people's mind, tariff is certainly one of those. If we think about the challenges that our economy has faced in the last, 4 years, inflation is one of those. So I wanted to give a little bit of time to thinking about sort of how inflation has moved in the last couple of years. So this is PCE. So there are two measures of inflation. We have Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, which is this, and the CPI. This is the one that policymakers use. So I chose to show this one. The red line is the headline index. The blue line is core. So it strips out food and energy. You can see that the horizontal line there is at 2%. The Federal Open Market Committee's stated objective is for 2% inflation. So we have seen that. We're moving back down towards that 2%, but we are not there yet. The next slide will talk about sort of housing and services and goods. But I want to point out, but before I move to that, that there have been some signs of inflation expectations moving up among consumers, short and long term, but there are also signs that longer term inflation expectations remain well anchored and have remained well anchored. So this is something that we are certainly paying a lot of attention to. And in fact, we have our own quarterly survey of our businesses and their expectations for inflation, which is in the field right now. So, I think this tells kind of the story of inflation in the last couple of years. So that red line is core goods. It's goods without energy. The purple line is core services without housing, and the dark blue line is housing. We can see from this here, the horizontal line is at 0. We can see sort of how we saw goods price inflation pick up. So again, this is a year-over-year percent change. Then we saw services follow that, and then we saw housing follow that. Prior to the last one or two reports, we saw goods price growth come back down to actually sort of putting downward pressure on that overall inflation, which is where it's been for the last 20, 30 years, right? So we haven't had inflation that has come from goods price inflation in a couple of decades, again, prior to 2021. So the housing one line here, based on some of the more recent market indexes for rent, the expectation is that comes down more in the next couple of months. Now, if you want to have a conversation about the longer term challenges in housing, we can do that. But the expectation is that comes down a little bit. This time a few months ago, I shouldn't say this time last year, I should say maybe a few months ago, core services was really sort of seen as that last mile in getting inflation back to the 2% target. We have seen some uptick in goods price and inflation recently. There are headwinds to inflation. Tariffs is certainly one for 2025, particularly. Other geopolitical realities, we hear about firms sort of talking about onshoring or nearshoring or friendshoring or whatever they're doing with respect to supply chains. It has been a challenging couple of years for supply chains, but of course those decisions are, they take quite a while. And then, there is, again, the question of wages in a world this is kind of over the longer term where we have labor supply that is not keeping up with labor demand. How do we kind of have wage growth sort of consistent with that 2% inflation target? So overall, so far, by the numbers, we continue to see growth. we haven't seen progress on inflation sort of continues, although it has flattened somewhat of late. So this is going to kind of lead into the next section on sentiment and risk to the outlook, which of course for Virginia, for the U.S. and for Virginia includes the conversation about federal workforce and spending. But I did want to point out, so if you look at that GDP number, 2/3 of that GDP number is consumer spending. And we have seen a very strong consumer in the U.S. For the last couple of years. We did see retail sales come down a little bit. This is the 12-month % change. You can also just look at the month, so December to January to February. We saw retail sales come down a little in January. A lot of people were attributing that to the weather that we saw in January. And in fact, that is consistent with comments that we got in our surveys of businesses that we run out of the Richmond Fed. But we did also see some slower growth than a lot of people were expecting for February. Nothing dramatic, nothing to suggest that the consumer is fully pulling back. But we saw particularly a drop in food service sales. This is just something that we want to pay attention to. Okay, so I want to talk about sort of the risks to the outlook broadly. One of the ways, we have a number of ways of gathering real-time information, when we have sort of lags in the hard data that we look at. One of them is we have people who are out on the ground. You might have come into contact with some of them, particularly in Virginia. We have a regional executive here in Virginia who's talking to businesses, nonprofits in urban and rural communities, trying to understand what's happening on the ground. The other way that we do it, and this comes out of my shop, are the surveys that we run. So we collaborate with Duke University and the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta on the CFO survey. This was released last week. In the fourth quarter, we saw a bump in optimism. So that blue line is respondents responding to the question of how do they rate their optimism on the overall U.S. economy? They had to rate it from 0 to 100. And then the red line, we ask about their own firm financial prospects. In something that I find comforting, we do usually see the own firm prospects above the economy expectations, and it doesn't move quite as dramatically as the expectations or optimism about the overall U.S. economy can. We saw a jump in optimism in the fourth quarter. We actually did a little pre- and post-election thing. A lot of that was due to the election. We saw the same thing in 2016, but then we saw a drop that almost took away all of those gains in the first quarter. We saw a decline in own firm prospects as well, or optimism about own firm prospects, but that did not fall quite as much. We also do ask them to assign probabilities to GDP growth in the next 4 quarters, and we saw those expectations for GDP growth come down from where they were actually for not only in the fourth quarter, but I believe in the third quarter of last year too. And the share of participants that expect to see declines in GDP has gone up, although again, still not a dramatic amount. So we asked them what are their most pressing concerns, and maybe not surprisingly, trade and tariffs jumped to the top of the list. So this is share of total mentions. About 30% of firms mentioned trade and tariffs as a concern. Inflation also rose. Uncertainty made it to the top 5 for the first time in a while. In fact, as long as I can remember, but it's certainly been at least a few years. And the political climate and the election concern didn't go down as much as you might expect, given that this survey was fielded after the election. I'll also point out that we had a couple of ways to try to understand how trade or tariffs particularly might be impacting firms' expectations for their own firm prospects. One way that we did was we looked at sort of the firms that were particularly exposed to the 3 countries that we hear about the most, which is Canada, China, and Mexico. And then we also took the firms that sort of mentioned or sort of were were analytically determined to be concerned about trade and tariffs. And for both of those, we found that the more concerned they are about tariffs or the more they trade with those countries, the worse their optimism or expectations were across a number of dimensions, including sort of their own firm employment or revenues or costs. Now, a lot of this must be somewhat speculative, and I want to point that out because the survey fielding period was February 19th to March 7th. And I think that the first round of larger tariffs, if I am remembering correctly, came in on March 4th. I think there were some changes on March 6th. So I want to point that out. The other thing that we asked, and this sort of, kind of transitions a little bit into sort of the federal government workforce, is we asked specifically about how they're hiring, and in the next slide, how their capital spending, how they expect that to be impacted by these four major policy areas that we've been hearing about a lot. So, the trade tariff policy did sort of come out as one where, more firms were expecting trade or tariff policy to sort of decrease their hiring. Again, this is about hiring, right? This is not necessarily about, reducing workforce, but anyway, decrease their hiring. Interestingly, the regulatory policy, we sort of had an equal amount talking about sort of whether that would increase their hiring or decrease their hiring. And then the corporate tax policy and the immigration policy, there was not, most respondents by far just did not anticipate a change, at least at this point from those policies. And that's one of the things that we hear as well, that it's really hard to get your sort of hands around what that means for your operations. Sort of similar results on capital spending. And I will, I'm happy to share links. We have most of this is published on our website in some way or another. So that was sort of business sentiment, and we're seeing the same thing in our 5th district surveys as well. And like I said before, that's something that we are looking at very carefully, especially as we get the April numbers in. We are looking to understand what the impacts might be in Virginia, Maryland, and DC versus other parts of our district, and firms that are more or less exposed to different types of policies. But this is a measure of consumer sentiment that, again, the hard numbers that we looked at before were pretty strong, but we're just seeing some decline in how consumers, households, businesses are sort of feeling, and their expectations for the future. So sentiment in March I put 2 here, but I'm going to talk about the consumer sentiment from the Michigan survey. We saw that decline, about 16 points, I think, from December. The current conditions fell, the long-term expectations fell, inflation expectations were up somewhat. Now, this is not, this is not at I think the lowest they've seen is 50. We're not there yet. But I also do want to point out that 2022, 2023 number, right? Which is, we'll see consumer sentiment move in ways that don't necessarily portend something for the economy. So I want to point that out. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that 2022 sort of consumer sentiment was connected to inflation, right? And it was that, we can talk about inflation going back to 2%. That's a growth measure. But for consumers, you don't see your grocery bill going back to where it was in 2020 or 2021. So I think that's one of the attributions that people make to that decline in consumer sentiment. But I think it's worth pointing out.
Madam Chair. Thanks. So on that slide you have there, it looks to me like consumer sentiment in the last measure a month or two ago, is identical to where it was. It looks like in the middle of 2008, which is right in the middle of the worst recession we've had, aside from the pandemic, whatever you want to call that, in the history of the state. So does the household sentiment index, does that tend to be a leading indicator, or does it tend to be a trailing indicator? In other words, or does it depend? So in other words, I've saw some articles in the last couple of days about stagflation and the risks that that's poses to us. That a lot of people think their incomes are going to go flat while the tariffs drive prices up, and that's going to and causing everybody to pull back. There's consumer spending. I think we're starting to see that in sales tax data and some other things right now. I saw that Americans concerned about job losses jumped from 30% to 66%. This one chart I'm looking at from the University of Michigan that came out a couple days ago.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about consumer spending? That it's already cut back, or they're going to cut back big time, or what? I'm trying to understand how to evaluate that.
Yeah, so I think it depends. I think it depends. And, I am not, I don't want to pretend to be an expert on the relationship between consumer spending and consumer sentiment by the Michigan survey. I can look into, we have a number of things sort of written on that. I'll say that it does, I don't know how much of a leading indicator it is or how much of a concurrent indicator it is, but the data can come out before some other data, right? So in that way, it could be a leading indicator. So because you will see that 2008, but like I said, you'll also see the 2022. And we didn't see a big pullback in consumer spending in 2022. I think there was, if I'm remembering what I have read correctly, I think that there was a stronger relationship between consumer spending and these kind of sentiment indexes before like 2021. I think this sort of, I don't want to say malaise feeling, but this sort of unhappiness about where the economy is and like the juxtaposition between that and the kind of spending that we've seen has been a big topic of conversation, at least in my building, in the last couple of years. So particularly again, 2022, 2023. I think this is a really important question. Does this mean that we're going to see a pullback in consumer spending, I think is what you're asking, or could this just be a blip and we start to see this come back up? I think, unfortunately, we're probably going to need a few more months of data to know where this is. I don't think it's a one-to-one relationship, but I also don't think it means nothing about how consumers are feeling about the economy. What's much easier for me, so there, like I said, there are papers out there that look at these relationships. What's easier for me to get my head around are our business surveys of businesses, I think in part because we see the comments from those businesses. And so far, those seem to be, and again, this is, I think the last I looked, what are we, April now? So it was probably realistically middle of March was the last time that I looked at where those measures are. There is sort of a declining sentiment and sort of an expectation for slower growth in anything from employment to shipments to sales, but it's not back to 2008 levels. So we'll see where that lands up in the next couple of weeks. And we have seen weaker responses, I should say, from those firms that are physically closer to DC, which is also, maybe not unexpected.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Senator Obenshain.
Madam Chair, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm just trying to figure out what Senator Saravel's looking at. It looks to me, and maybe I'm looking at this wrong, it looks like there, and maybe this is a cautionary tale about looking at sentiment, but it looks like from 2020 through mid-2022, there was a huge drop, and in 2022, consumer confidence was well below where it is today. And if you were to look at consumer confidence as an indicator of likely recession, I think whether you're looking at consumer confidence or CEO predictions and business predictions, I think a lot of folks were looking at that in 21, 22, and 23 as pretty strong indicators that we were entering into a recession, which never really materialized. So, isn't that kind of a cautionary note about putting too much weight on consumer sentiment?
Yeah, I think it's a caution. I think I agree with your reading of that chart. I think it's a cautionary note. There's always a cautionary note on putting too much on one indicator at all. But I think survey measures, we have to kind of look carefully at measures of sentiment as well. Like I said, if you look at, and we can break this down a little bit more, which might give us actually a little bit more insight. Like I said with the CFO survey, the sentiment about the economy moves a lot more than sentiment about your own firm prospects, and own firm prospects tend to be higher, right? So people are sort of looking at the newspaper, and my interpretation of this, and again, by the way, these are my views and not the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. Should have said that from the beginning, and I might repeat that a few times since I neglected to say that in the beginning. But my view of that is that you open the newspaper and you feel like, the economy is not doing well, the country's not doing well, the world isn't doing well, but my firm will be okay. Like I'm looking at my balance sheet, I'm looking at sort of, the indicators that I look at for my business, and I'm feeling okay about it. So I think that those expectations for own firm is probably something that I think about more closely if I'm sort of and their expectations for employment. So in the CFO survey, we saw that huge bump in optimism in the fourth quarter. We didn't see expectations for their own employment, revenues, prices, wages change that much. So they were more optimistic about the economy, but their expectations for their own firm prospects were about the same as they were the quarter before. So yes, I agree with that
Madam
interpretation.
Chair.
Senator Dean.
Just between Senators Obenshane and Serval, the way I read these lines, consumer sentiment in Michigan was much lower in 2022, but nationally, we are about where we were in 2022, the way I read those numbers. The way I read all these charts is we're down that low in large part because of uncertainty about the tariffs.
Yes, I think uncertainty is something. Now, in this chart, some of that uncertainty did align with tariff uncertainty, and some of it didn't. So there seems to be an elevated level of uncertainty. I think tariffs are the thing, at least from what we hear, that are most on the minds of the firms that we talk to. But I think there is sort of uncertainty broadly that people are reacting to. But I agree with that. I mean, and we could also see, now I'm speculating, but if it's true that in 2022, those low levels of sentiment were tied to, say, grocery bills, were tied to the amount that consumers were paying versus what they were paying in 2019, and if the expectation is that we're not going to see inflation come back down, they could be reacting to that as well, which could be directly tariff connected. But again, that's more speculative than I should probably do. Okay. So I think this is where we get into Senator Serval's questions about where people live versus where people work. I think that is a very important question to think about in Virginia as we look at the impacts of any decline in federal government workforce and spending. So these charts are on workforce. I have one on spending. We actually did also write a couple of pieces connected to this. I know that Bob McNabb at ODU has done some work. I think that right here you have staff that are trying to understand what the impact will be or could be on Virginia for spending and workforce. So I'm just going to talk about this a little bit, but I don't want to pretend to be the expert in Virginia. So the top chart here is data from the Office of Personnel Management. It is by place of work, right? So these are the federal agencies that are that are in Virginia and employing people, so the people could live in other parts of the country. But when we think about sort of but a lot of these people we also know do live in Virginia, and when we think about the agencies that are the largest federal government employers in Virginia, we have a lot of it is sort of somehow defense connected. So Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, Department of the Army, Veterans Affairs. Contrast this with Maryland that has a lot of HHS or a lot of commerce as well. This does not include USPS data. Importantly, it also does not include military or some CIA or some of those agencies. So that's the top chart. The bottom left chart is the number of civilian workers this is ACS data, so that is a typo that I see now on this chart. It's not ACE data, it's ACS data. And it's the number of civilian workers aged 16 plus employed by the federal government. In this chart, you can see, of course, we have Fairfax County, Prince William County, Arlington County, right? So we have these Northern Virginia counties that have the largest number of federal government workers. But then if you think about share of employment, which is the chart on the right, some of the smaller counties actually could be impacted more by cuts to federal government spending or workforce, again, depending on sort of where those cuts happen. So, we looked actually at the whole U.S. and the largest, the county with the largest share of federal government employment is Los Alamos, right? So, I mean, some of these smaller rural counties actually have a pretty large share of civilian workers. So I wanted to point that out. And of course, a lot of this is Northern Virginia. And I remember, spending a fair amount of time in 2013 and 2014 thinking about sort of contract dollars and thinking about workforce. And of course, Northern Virginia came up a lot, but as we all know, Hampton Roads does as well with the naval station and then all of the activity that surrounds that in terms of military and civilian. So the chart on the right is what I want to start with here. So there's one thing which is like cuts to workforce. There's also thinking about spending. And federal government employment is about 2% of U.S. employment. It's actually been there pretty steady since the late 90s. We've seen the number of federal government workers go up as a share of employment in the U.S. It has not gone up that much. But as we saw this decline in the 90s of federal government workforce, we also saw an increase in contract dollars. And Virginia, Maryland, Texas, California have been the biggest receivers of contract dollars for as long as I have been at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, at least. And actually, for a while, Virginia and California were sort of vying for that top spot, but Virginia and Maryland are smaller economies. So as a share of economic activity, these contract dollars matter a lot in Virginia and in Maryland. And a lot of this does translate into professional business services in Northern Virginia, or we also do see manufacturing, of course, in Hampton Roads. So that's the chart on the right. So the chart on the left is federal grants as a share of state personal income, and here Virginia aligns much more with the U.S. and with other states. We also can look at federal government transfer. So that's the other sort of big source of spending for the federal government, transfers to state and local governments. And there, actually, Virginia is one of the lower states, at least in the district, but I think in the U.S. in terms of federal government money, right? So like West Virginia has a much higher share of their revenue coming from federal government transfers than Virginia does. Again, this is an article that is on our website, and we have an economist in our department who has done quite a bit of work looking at federal government spending. So I'm happy to put him in touch with anybody as well.
Madam Chair. So again, so your chart on the right, recipients of federal contracts, again, it's hard for me to meet a person in Northern Virginia that doesn't either work for the government or a contractor or derive their money from them like I do, practicing law, defending them in court or divorcing them or whatever. So when you say up there recipients of federal contracts, are those dollars that are spent in Virginia? Or like, for example, if there's a California company that has all of its employees in Virginia because it's near the federal government, does that show up as a California grant or Virginia grant? Not grant, I'm sorry, recipient of federal contract in terms of the dollars per capita and all that. I'm trying to understand like where the dollars are spent or where the dollars are sent.
Yeah, so we can look at it either way. This is recipient. So these are Virginia-based firms, and I think it's actually also where the money is spent. I can check into that because we were looking at it in two different. I think so. So these are contract dollars. that are, so you could, because you could also, okay, I'm sorry, you could also have a California firm that has, gets a contract, but then has like a number of different subsidiaries, right? And so where that money goes, my understanding is that this is where the money, I don't know if it's where it's spent, but it's where it actually ends up. So if it goes to a California firm, but then it goes through that firm to like an establishment in Virginia, that this is counted as Virginia, is my understanding.
Madam Chair. So I'm clear. So for example, Amazon, headquartered in Seattle.
Yes.
Amazon Web Services, which has become a massive government contractor, but all that work is probably mostly done in Northern Virginia. That money goes, even though it's sent to Seattle, in your chart here on the right, it's reflected as Virginia money?
Yeah, as long as when the contract was done, the place of, like there's a word I'm looking for. It's not place of work, but it's like place of whatever recipient. Somebody knows. Is in the contract. Then yes, it would count as Virginia and not as Washington.
Okay. Thanks.
Senator Obenshain.
That's fine.
I only heard part of it, but I want to hear.
You want to hear part?
Yeah, I want to hear the other
Hear me
part.
say something?
Yes.
Okay. But the converse is also true, that there may be Virginia firms that receive grant funding, and some of that, a good bit of that funding is spent in other states or across the country.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And this, of course, doesn't include any multiplier effects of that money. And I mean that, like, even in workforce, right? So we think about DC, Maryland, and Virginia. DC, Maryland, and Virginia are about 20% of federal government employment. So I think it is appropriate for us to be thinking, a lot about what this might mean for Virginia. I think that there are a lot of communities, around the country that are trying to figure out what the impact could be for them too. Okay, so this is definitely not updated. So my understanding is that we have publicly available through 3/15. And I heard a rumor yesterday that VEC might have for at least Virginia, through 3/22. So I just want to be clear about that up front. This is unemployment insurance. The blue line is sort of those standard UI claims. The green line is the UCFE, which is the unemployment compensation for federal employees. And then the orange line is for the service, for the military. So the UCFE number, which is the one that we've been looking at, quite closely, is my understanding is 564. So this is initial claims as well, by the way. So continuing claims are elevated, right? But they're not crazy elevated, and we have seen some decline in the initial claims. We can see that jump that we saw in earlier this year is actually not completely inconsistent with what we've seen at the start of past presidential administration shifts. In January, it's not inconsistent with what we've seen in January and February of sort of presidential administration changeovers, or however, hopefully that's clear. We saw much bigger jumps, for example, in 2013 and 2014 during the sequester. Now, importantly, you must become, to qualify for any of these, you have to become unemployed through no fault of your own. And also, it's not for the UCFE, it's not going to include any deferred resignation. It's not going to include paid administrative leave. And, like I just said, you can't be fired for cause. So there could be things that are, right now missing in this data that will kind of tick it up as we move forward. So the next slide this is unemployment insurance, again, sort of traditional unemployment insurance for our states. That jump in North Carolina, that was Hurricane Helene, if you remember. So Virginia did in the most recent week of the data, Virginia did go up. If you look at initial claims are a little elevated in Virginia. They're not that they're not crazy. Continuing claims also seem a little bit elevated, but again, not yet, or not at super high levels. The unemployment compensation for federal employees by state saw big jumps. And here, the DC continuing claims number is quite high. It's close to 800, and that's high by historical standards. Maryland is also pretty high, and Virginia is elevated compared to where it's been. So this is a measure that we are going to be looking at pretty closely as we move forward.
Madam Chair.
Senator Overton.
So that chart only goes back to 23.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, I happen to know that Virginia residents who have filed for unemployment for jobs that they've had in DC through about the middle of March, there are 560 of them for the beginning of this year. Do you know how that matches up to the beginning of the last couple of presidential administrations, whether that is higher, lower, normal?
So if I'm remembering back when we saw those first spikes, and compared to when we saw the first spike for the US, if I'm remembering correctly, these are actually elevated compared to past changes in presidential administration. So DC, Maryland, and Virginia are seeing more unemployment claims filed for federal government workers than they did in, say, 2020 January or 2016 January. But I can look into that and confirm that.
So you think more than 560 is more than in the past several administrations? And can you find that data?
Let me check that. Let me find that out.
Thank you.
But I am remembering looking at, like I said, when those first started to go up. In the U.S., it was still somewhat consistent with history, and in Virginia and D.C. and Maryland, it wasn't. But if I'm remembering correctly, in Virginia, the highest number was actually in 2013, 2014 during sequestration. So I don't think we're back to that level, but I think we're above sort of past presidential changeovers. But I can look into that.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is actually, I think, basically my last slide. I just wanted to point out, so this is also from February 2020. Maybe it makes more sense at this point to look at year over year, which we can also do. But I just wanted to point out that within Virginia, we have, of course, seen employment growth differ across regions. We haven't seen Northern Virginia sort of grow as strongly as it was. It hasn't been leading the state in employment growth in the last, say 10 years, the way that it was in the 90s. And in fact, some of the strength that we've seen in North and South Carolina have come from the metro areas. Winchester has been growing strongly, but still only about 2% of employment in the state. Richmond has actually picked up in the last year and a half. And that's a bigger deal when it comes to the state as a whole, because it's about 18% of employment in the state. And then Virginia Beach has been kind of trailing, although has also picked up recently. So I just wanted to point out that we can see this play out differently in different parts of the state, and particularly among the metro areas. So on the whole, like I said, we haven't seen in the numbers. We've seen some slowdown. Maybe there are some high-frequency indicators you can look at. I saw an article about a small business sort of hiring survey that sort of indicates that small businesses are hiring less. We haven't seen that in our surveys, at least by the middle of March. We'll see what we see in the next couple of weeks. But on the whole, the hard data that we have is still, relatively solid. Sentiment has certainly fallen. What that means for economic activity, we can continue to talk about. And there are a lot of sort of uncertain factors that are weighing on the minds of the firms that we survey, both sort of in the CFO survey and for us. And of course, as you all know, or you wouldn't be sitting here, the question of federal workforce and spending reductions is an important one to think about in Virginia.
Madam Chair. Thank you, Sonia. So I had one other question of something you didn't mention here at all, which is about tariffs and exports. So when I look at what Virginia's top exports are, it used to be semiconductors, but then the plant closed down. So now it's bituminous coal. After that, it's soy products, which I think is Virginia's #1 agricultural export, a whole bunch of different categories of soy. Then after that, it says it's diesel, tractor trailers. Our top export countries are #1, Canada, #2, China, #3, India, after that, Mexico, and then Germany. And I think most of this export risk is to the rural parts of the Commonwealth. That's where all the soybeans come from. The tractor trailers are made in Pulaski. The coal, I'm not sure if that's at risk, but if it's going to China or India, who knows? Are you all looking at the risks that these reciprocal tariffs are going to pose to Virginia's exports, which obviously are a big deal for the port and also for our rural parts of the Commonwealth? Because I didn't hear the reciprocal risks on tariffs mentioned at all. I know there's thought about how it affects consumer spending and all that in terms of what's coming in, but in terms of what's going out, it seems to me we are extraordinarily at risk on that as well. Do you have any thoughts, or have you evaluated that at all?
So we have we've been spending more time on imports. We have spent some time, we have an economist in our shop who's spent some time looking at the effective tariff rate by industry and also by county, and you can see some of that, right? And part of this is also to focus our outreach staff as they go out and try to understand what the implications are. Where could they or should they go? And like you said, like a lot of on the import side, a lot of those imports are going to some of our more rural counties. We have not done as much on the export side, I think in part because it's been hard enough to know what our import tariffs are going to look like. It's been really hard to sort of think about what those retaliatory tariffs might look like. So we haven't done much, but I think that we have the structure in place to be able to do that. I think I wouldn't be. There are definitely parts of the Fifth Federal Reserve District as a whole where, I'm thinking of South Carolina, I'm thinking of auto manufacturing in South Carolina, where we are going to need to understand the impacts of those retaliatory tariffs on different areas by industry and then by county. So I think that's a good thing for us to look into more carefully. We just put out, for the U.S. as a whole, we just put out an economic brief this morning, understanding sort of that effective tariff rate and incorporate some of this CFO survey and what industries are going to be most impacted. And I think one of the challenges is that manufacturing is one that will be impacted, and a lot of that is in some of our lower population density areas.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. This has been extremely enlightening, and I did have space for questions and answers, but I think the questions have already been asked and the answers have already been given. So with that, this subcommittee will continue to monitor federal actions and understand the impacts. Of course, staff is available to assist members, and please provide suggestions, any member of the committee, on topics of concern to you. I know I certainly have about over 24 questions myself, and I've asked most of those while I've been sitting here next to April. I'm sorry, get those answers later. But the subcommittee will next meet on May 20th in Northern Virginia. We've heard Northern Virginia a lot, so that's where we're going to be. Location to be announced, but the next meeting of this special subcommittee will be on May 20th. And so with that, so we can get the joint rules, the committee will rise.
This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.